Tokyo Bay, July 1944. The night air hung heavy with summer humidity. The faint scent of salt water drifted inland, clinging to the wooden eaves of homes that stood in near-total darkness. Before we begin, if you love uncovering forgotten World War II stories, take a second to subscribe. Along narrow alleys, the only light came from oil lamps carefully hidden behind rice paper screens. Japan was at war, and by now, every window was a soldier's discipline. Every shadow, a silent prayer that the empire's enemies would never breach the homeland's sacred sky. But that night, the stillness felt strange, unsettled. Somewhere high above, an unfamiliar vibration began to ripple through the heavens, a low, steady hum, like distant thunder frozen in the thin air of the stratosphere. No one below could see it yet. Even the radar stations barely caught the faint signal. Yet that sound, heavy, constant, almost alive, was the echo of something entirely new. 30,000 feet above the earth, invisible against the darkness, the first B-29 Superfortresses of the U.S. Army Air Forces crossed the Pacific winds. Their silver bodies gleamed faintly under the moonlight, each one carrying the weight of thousands of pounds of bombs, and a promise made by American industry and willpower that no distance, no ocean, no fortress would remain safe. Below, Japan slept uneasily, unaware that this night would change its very concept of safety forever. For centuries, the Japanese homeland had been a sanctuary, insulated by geography, guarded by myth. Even as Tokyo expanded into a modern capital, even as the war raged from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Marianas, the heart of the empire remained untouched. The Imperial General Staff believed the home islands were secure, protected by distance and the limitations of enemy aircraft. Until now. In 1944, the American B-29 Superfortress entered the war, a machine unlike any aircraft before it. Designed to fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber in existence, it could soar at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. It was a fortress in the sky, armed with remote-controlled machine guns, powered by engines that represented the peak of Allied engineering. The project itself, codenamed Matterhorn, was one of the most expensive military programs in human history, surpassing even the Manhattan Project in its complexity and scope. Factories across the United States worked day and night to produce the components. Aluminum skins from Pennsylvania, engines from Michigan, avionics from California. America was not simply fighting a war, it was outproducing it, and now that industrial miracle was coming home to Japan. On the ground, Japanese commanders still clung to an outdated map of the world. To them, the Pacific was a shield, the empire's defensive ring of islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, was the unbreakable wall against Western intrusion. Even after losing Saipan in July 1944, many refused to accept that the Americans could actually strike the mainland effectively. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had prepared for short-range battles, for dogfights at low altitude, for honorable combat between men who could see one another. But the B-29 shattered that code. When the first radar reports reached Tokyo command centers, multiple contacts, altitude 30,000 feet, direction south-southeast, disbelief turned to dread. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire blindly into the night sky, their shells bursting far below the bomber's altitude. The explosions painted fleeting orange blossoms against the black canvas of heaven, yet none touched the silver giants above. The Japanese gunners never even saw their enemy. What they expected was a fight. What they experienced was silence. And then the earth trembling. That night, a new sound entered Japan's memory, the deep, metallic heartbeat of the B-29 engines. It wasn't the snarling roar of a Zero, nor the rhythmic drone of twin-engine bombers. It was steady, mechanical, relentless, the sound of a nation that had mastered industry. To the people below, that sound became a symbol. It represented the unending rhythm of American production, a rhythm powered not by an emperor's command, but by a nation's collective determination. Every hum in the sky echoed the turning of factory belts in Kansas, the pounding of hammers in Seattle, the flow of fuel through pipelines that stretched across continents. For Japan, that sound was foreign, almost inhuman. For America, it was the music of democracy at work. Japanese reports from the night of August 10, 1944, described the first B-29 raids over the home islands. Enemy planes approached at an altitude too great for interception, one officer wrote. Their presence could be heard but not seen. Anti-aircraft fire ineffective. American mission logs from the 20th Air Force confirm it. The first waves targeted the Yawata steelworks, Japan's heart of military industry. Out of 75 bombers that set out, 62 reached the target area. Only 2 were lost to mechanical failure. Not a single one was shot down. It was a warning written in fire and steel. The age of untouchable skies was over. And for the first time, the Empire realized that geography no longer guaranteed survival. Within weeks, the Japanese High Command began to shift its defensive doctrine. Fighter units were retrained to climb higher, new radar systems were rushed into production, and engineers scrambled to develop interceptors capable of reaching 30,000 feet. But it was too late. The industrial foundation of Japan simply could not match the pace of American innovation. Every improvement made by the empire took months. Every countermeasure, another desperate measure. Meanwhile, American factories produced hundreds of new bombers each week. The shock was not merely strategic, it was philosophical. The Japanese war ethos had been built on human spirit, on sacrifice and courage. Yet now they faced an enemy who fought with machines, logistics, and endless resources. It was no longer warrior against warrior, but system against system, and the American system was unstoppable. As dawn approached, the last echoes of the B-29s faded into the sky. Smoke rose gently from Yawata's industrial ruins, carried northward by the same winds that had once guarded Japan's shores. On the ground, survivors stared upward, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The air itself seemed haunted, filled with the ghostly hum of engines that had come and gone, leaving behind a silence far heavier than sound. For the first time in history, the Empire of Japan had been struck at its core, and though the damage that night was limited, the psychological blow was immeasurable. Because from that night onward, the Japanese knew the sky, once their shield, now belonged to someone else. The next night, Japan's air defense network waited. Searchlights swept the sky above Kyushu like pale fingers searching for ghosts. Every radar operator was on edge, staring at green screens that flickered and bled static. They knew the Americans would return, but no one knew from where or when. And when the hum came again, faint at first, the reaction was chaos. Alarms wailed through Fukuoka, sirens echoing across sleeping neighborhoods. Anti-aircraft gunners loaded shells with trembling hands. Pilots scrambled toward their fighters, engines coughing in the humid dark. But when they reached altitude, they found nothing, only empty stars. The B-29s were already miles above them, invisible, untouchable, as if flying in another world. From those icy heights, the bomb bay doors opened. One by one, clusters of incendiaries fell, tumbling silently through the atmosphere. By the time they reached the earth, they screamed. Explosions bloomed across the industrial districts, painting the night in waves of orange and white. The Japanese defenders fired wildly upward, tracing hopeful arcs into nothingness. The shells burst far below the bombers, like fireworks celebrating their own futility. Inside Tokyo command centers, officers stood in disbelief. Reports came from Yawata, then Nagasaki, then Omura. Every city hit from an altitude beyond their reach. "Impossible," muttered one general. "No machine can fly that high." But the Americans had built one. At 30,000 feet, the B-29 crews flew in sub-zero temperatures. Frost formed on their oxygen masks. Their hands ached against the controls, yet the cockpit glowed with quiet efficiency. Dials, gauges, a mechanical heartbeat. They could see the curve of the earth below. Somewhere under the drifting clouds, the Pacific shimmered like black glass. Each man knew what this meant. They were carrying the war to Japan itself. Not as invaders, but as shadows above the stars. The Japanese had prided themselves on bravery, the courage of the samurai, reborn in their soldiers and pilots. But courage could not reach that high. No matter how fiercely they fought, they could not touch what they could not see. And as each night passed, a realization spread across Japan's military leadership. Their enemies were not simply men with weapons. They were engineers, scientists, and workers united by industry, the spirit of democracy forged into metal. Even the sound of the B-29s became an omen. That steady hum, once foreign, now haunted the Japanese psyche. It echoed in nightmares, in the silence between air raid sirens, in the empty skies above Tokyo. Children learned to recognize it before the first explosions came. The bombers didn't just destroy buildings. They destroyed confidence. They proved that Japan's isolation, the centuries-long myth of invulnerability, was over. After every raid, Japanese engineers studied the wreckage of crashed B-29s with desperate fascination. "What metal is this?" they asked. "What fuel burns so long? What mind built such an engine?" But the answers were always the same: too advanced, too distant, too late. And so, the empire turned inward. Its leaders began to understand that the war was no longer being fought by warriors. It was being decided by factories. The Americans had turned production into a weapon, and that weapon was now flying above Japan's highest mountains. As the last echoes faded over the Sea of Japan, the defenders stood in the glow of their own fires. For every explosion they saw below, another truth burned deeper. The enemy they fought could not be reached with bullets or bravery. They had entered an age where power came not from the sword, but from the machine. In the months that followed the first B-29 raids, Japan's air defenses stiffened, but the results barely changed. Each new night, searchlights raked the heavens, and each new dawn revealed more blackened ruins. The bombers came from beyond reach, from a world so high that even imagination strained to follow. For Japanese officers, it was not only a military crisis, it was humiliation. They had been trained to believe that spirit triumphed over steel, that devotion could conquer technology. But the B-29 defied every code. It did not fight honorably. It did not even fight visibly. It arrived, released destruction, and vanished into the thin air of its own supremacy. Across the Pacific, the reality was very different. Inside American factories, men and women in denim and grease-stained uniforms worked beneath the roar of machinery. Riveters hammered fuselages, conveyor belts carried wings the size of houses, The same hum that haunted Japan filled these halls, but here it was creation, not terror. That hum became the pulse of a new kind of warfare. Industrial democracy. In Wichita, Kansas alone, a single Boeing plant produced more aircraft in a month than Japan could in a year. Each plane was a monument to collective labor, built not by generals, but by citizens. Housewives tested radios, teenagers welded bomb doors, engineers perfected oxygen systems that would let American airmen breathe above the clouds. To the Japanese, this seemed impossible. How could a nation of workers surpass an empire of warriors? Yet the answer unfolded every night in fire. Japanese scientists dissected every downed superfortress they could recover. This alloy resists heat, one report noted. The wiring, insulated beyond known standards. They found oxygen regulators, pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, each one a revelation of what industrial freedom could achieve. Still, they could not reproduce it. Their supply lines were strangled, their materials scarce, their cities already burning. The B-29 was not merely a machine, it was proof that America's strength came from abundance, an abundance of ideas, of hands, of will. By winter of 1944, Japan's generals began to speak in private tones of inevitability. The Americans have conquered distance, one admiral confessed, and with it, they have conquered time. Night after night, the sound returned, steady, deliberate, merciless. Civilians whispered that the Americans could bomb from heaven itself. Priests spoke of thunder gods betrayed. Every rumble overhead seemed to announce a truth no one could silence. Japan's skies no longer belonged to Japan. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's advisors urged new strategies. Underground factories were proposed, radar nets expanded, interceptor prototypes rushed to testing. But nothing kept pace with the storm. For every 10 B-29s lost, 50 more took their place. America's war machine was now self-sustaining, a living organism fed by freedom. And through it all, the sound remained, that deep metallic hum, echoing through both nations. In one, it meant progress. In the other, despair. By spring of 1945, Japan's leaders knew the symbol of that sound, once thought to be just engines, had become something greater, the heartbeat of modern power. As the last of the winter fires died out, Japan stood beneath an empty sky, waiting for the next wave. The people no longer looked up with hope, but with resignation. They had seen what distance could do. They had learned that in this new age, victory did not come from courage alone. It came from creation. The American factory, humming endlessly thousands of miles away, had become the new fortress. It was not surrounded by walls, but by ideas, and from it, the sky itself had been conquered. March 9th, 1945. Tokyo was sleeping beneath a thin veil of mist. Wooden rooftops gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and the Sumida River drifted silently through the city like a dark ribbon of glass. For months, people had grown used to the distant hum of American planes, always high, always unreachable. They believed altitude was safety. They were wrong. At 10:30 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across the capital. This time, the sound came lower, heavier, faster. The B-29s had returned, but something was different. They were flying beneath the clouds. Their engines thundered not like distant gods, but like machines descending into the human world. General Curtis LeMay had changed everything. He ordered the bombers to abandon precision and embrace saturation. Instead of high-altitude strikes with explosive ordnance, they would fly low and drop fire. Thousands of tons of napalm and incendiaries designed to burn entire cities. From the night sky, America released a storm of flame. Clusters of M69 bombs fell in patterns across Tokyo's wooden wards. Each one burst open, scattering gel-like fire that clung to everything it touched. Walls, roofs, human skin. Within minutes, the capital was an inferno. The wind from Tokyo Bay turned flames into whirlwinds. The oxygen burned out of the streets themselves. In command, bunkers beneath the Imperial Palace, officers could only stare at maps turning red with loss. Their guns could not reach. Their fighters could not climb. Their courage meant nothing. The bombers moved in perfect formation, disciplined, methodical, unstoppable. One Japanese officer would later write, "We fought the wind and lost. The Americans controlled the sky. The fire controlled us." From above, the crews of the B-29s saw the city glowing like molten metal. Even through their oxygen masks, they could smell the smoke of a dying empire. The sight was horrifying, yet to them, it was also the visible end of a nightmare that had begun at Pearl Harbor. For every pilot, this mission was both vengeance and burden. By dawn, more than 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ashes. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. The city's heart had been burned out in a single night. On the ground, survivors wandered through streets of ash and twisted iron. The familiar hum of the B-29s still echoed faintly above the smoke. To them, it had become the voice of judgment, the rhythm of a distant power that no sword or spirit could defy. To the Americans, that same sound meant something else. It was proof that technology, organization, and unity had reshaped warfare itself. No longer did victory belong to the strongest soldier. It belonged to the strongest system. The B-29, born in the factories of Wichita and Detroit, had turned into the ultimate symbol of industrial democracy. Each plane was a flying testament to millions of anonymous workers who had forged its wings. And that night, as Tokyo burned, the contrast between the two worlds became unmissable. One nation fought with faith, the other fought with factories. One prayed to the past, the other built the future. When the last bomb fell and the sky turned gray with morning, Japan's capital was silent except for the crackle of embers and the faint echo of engines fading toward the horizon. It was not just a military defeat, it was an ideological collapse, a moment when the empire's belief in divine protection was consumed by fire. That sound, the deep, rhythmic pulse of American engines, lingered above the ruins like a prophecy. It said that the modern world had arrived, and it could not be stopped. The morning after the Tokyo firebombing, a gray silence blanketed the capital. Where once stood endless rows of wooden homes, only scorched foundations remained. Smoke coiled into the pale sky like unburied ghosts, the smell of ash and oil mixed with something older, the scent of a nation realizing its own mortality. From the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito was led through the wreckage in a black car. He watched from behind glass as his people sifted through what had once been their lives. Streets were gone. Temples were gone. Even the air felt hollow. Tokyo, the shining jewel of the empire, had been reduced to dust in a single night. Across the city, the same question echoed from every survivor's lips. How could they do this? The answer, though few could see it, was buried not in Tokyo's soil, but across the Pacific, in the furnaces of American industry. For every home destroyed in Japan, 1,000 workers in the U.S. had built something new: a wing, a bomb casing, a cockpit panel. Each part fit into a machine that transcended the battlefield. The American arsenal had become a kind of democracy in motion, the combined labor of farmers, engineers, housewives, and immigrants. Their unity produced not just weapons, but inevitability. In Japan, the contrast was unbearable. The war effort had consumed everything: metal, rice, even school children's toys. Propaganda still promised victory through purity and sacrifice, yet the people now saw the truth reflected in the sky. The Americans fought not with faith, but with factories. And that faith, in machines, in mass production, in shared purpose, had become the empire's undoing. By the spring of 1945, Japan's cities fell one by one under waves of B-29s. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Each attack followed the same pattern: a rising hum, a curtain of fire, a silence afterward so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The Japanese military called it Kuchu no Kabe, the wall in the sky. It was their way of admitting that they could no longer fight upward. Their anti-aircraft guns burst below invisible targets. Their fighters stalled before reaching the bomber's altitude. Each failure stripped away another layer of belief. In the ruins, people began to understand that something greater than weapons had defeated them. The American system, vast, mechanical, yet strangely human, was unlike anything Japan had ever faced. It was a war fought not for conquest, but for dominance of the modern age. Among the ashes, a different kind of silence took hold. Not fear, but exhaustion. The citizens of Tokyo no longer ran when sirens wailed. They simply looked up. They had seen the face of a new kind of warfare, one that didn't shout or charge, but hummed steadily in the distance, inevitable as sunrise. In the burned districts, melted metal curled like petals, and the faint smell of charred paper drifted from what had once been schools and libraries. Every breeze carried whispers of loss, but also something else: a strange, reluctant awe at the sheer reach of human creation. To the Japanese commanders, that awe turned to dread. If a single nation could build a fleet of machines capable of erasing cities, then no empire, no army, no tradition was safe. That realization broke something deeper than morale. It broke faith. When the next American formation appeared over the horizon, there was no surprise left, only acceptance. The empire's walls, once built of pride and myth, now lay buried beneath the ashes of its own capital. And above it all, the sound remained, the same eternal hum that had begun months ago over Yawata. It was the voice of the future, moving onward, higher, beyond reach. August 1945. The war was nearing its end, though few yet dared to say the word surrender. Across Japan, the nights were still haunted by the same sound, the deep, resonant hum of the B-29s. But now it was no longer a mystery. Everyone knew what followed that sound: fire, silence, surrender. The once proud empire had been reduced to fragments of its own belief. Cities that had stood for centuries were flattened. The Imperial Navy lay rusting in harbors it could no longer defend. And high above, the silver bombers still roamed, untouched and unchallenged, messengers of an age that Japan could not stop from arriving. On August 6th, one B-29 crossed the sky unlike any before it. Its name was Enola Gay, its cargo, a single bomb built not of fire, but of light itself. When it fell upon Hiroshima, the sun seemed to rise from the earth. In seconds, a city vanished. The world entered a new era. The B-29 had begun as a machine of altitude, of unreachable precision. But by war's end, it had become something larger, a symbol of transformation. It marked the moment humanity realized it could destroy itself as easily as it could create. For Japan, the experience was absolute. The sound that once represented fear now became memory. A reminder that no island, no ocean, no wall of faith could stand against the age of industry. When Emperor Hirohito addressed his people on August 15th, his voice trembled through the radio, distorted but clear. "We must endure the unendurable." The war was over, and as those words spread across the smoldering landscape, something in the Japanese spirit shifted. The same sky that had brought destruction would soon bring something else. Airplanes carrying food, medicine, reconstruction materials. The hum that once terrified now returned as hope. Out of ruin, Japan began to rebuild, not as an empire, but as a nation learning from the silence that followed defeat. The symbol of that transformation was still the same: the sound, the steady mechanical rhythm of engines, once the voice of enemy bombers, now became the heartbeat of recovery. American cargo planes filled the sky again, but this time they carried supplies instead of bombs. The contrast was almost poetic, democracy feeding where it had once destroyed. For the Americans, too, the B-29 left a complicated legacy. It was the machine that ended the bloodiest war in history, but also the reminder of what power unchecked by conscience could do. The hum of those engines lingered in the veterans' memories long after the war ended, a sound both triumphant and sorrowful. History would later call it technological supremacy, but to those who lived beneath it, it was something more human. The proof that progress comes at a cost, and that power without wisdom reshapes the world in fire. When historians look back at that summer of 1945, they see more than bombs and ruins. They see a turning point, the moment when humanity crossed from the age of empires into the age of machines. And the B-29, that gleaming fortress of aluminum and courage, was the bridge between them. Even now, the old recordings of those engines carry a strange poetry. The low, even pulse of 4 massive propellers turning against the wind, the sound of distance conquered, of industry unleashed, of nations learning what it meant to be small beneath their own inventions. That sound still belongs to history, but also to eternity. It reminds us that freedom, abundance, and democracy are not born from comfort. They are forged, like those planes, in heat and pressure and purpose. The night the B-29s came, Japan saw the future descend from the stars. And when the fires burned out, the world woke into a new dawn, one built not by emperors or conquerors, but by the unstoppable hum of human creation.